Lu Mei's morning was already off to a bad start, which was strange because the universe had no real reason to mess with her. She was late for work, sure, but it was Tuesday, and the universe had a history of not caring about Tuesdays. And yet, there she was, standing at the corner of her apartment building, staring at something that could only be described as insane. A horse. But not just any horse. This one was galloping down the middle of the intersection, oblivious to the honking cars and screaming pedestrians, wearing a frilly, bright pink tutu and a top hat. It was as if the horse had walked straight out of some inexplicable dream, or worse, a circus from a parallel universe. Lu Mei squinted at the scene. She wasn't sure whether she was hallucinating, but then the horse did a little twirl, the tutu swishing out in an absurdly graceful motion. Okay, she muttered to herself. Definitely not a hallucination. In fact, it was exactly the sort of bizarre thing that happened when she used her powers. See, Lu Mei had a secret. She had the ability to manipulate time. A gift, or curse, depending on how you looked at it, that she'd discovered in her early 20s when an electrical storm had zapped through her, leaving behind something much more dangerous than just frizzy hair. At first, it was a small thing. She could rewind time a few seconds, or pause it long enough to grab a coffee without missing a train. Fun, harmless stuff. But the more she played with it, the more complicated things got. And now, a horse wearing a tutu in the middle of downtown Beijing was the result. The traffic was gridlocked, people were honking their horns, and the pedestrian crossing light blinked red, but no one seemed to know what to do. Lu Mei, standing at the corner and watching the scene unfold, took a deep breath and rubbed her temples. Not again, she groaned. She'd been trying to keep things under control, really, she had. But she'd had a mishap the day before. A minor thing, really. A little accident at an intersection when a car had almost hit a pedestrian. Lu Mei had felt it was too dangerous to let the person get hurt. So, she'd rewound time by a few seconds and fixed it. No big deal, right? Except, apparently, that tiny alteration had caused a ripple in the timeline. And now, this horse. The universe had a wicked sense of humor, and right now, it was laughing at her expense. Lu Mei glanced around for some sort of authority to handle the situation, perhaps an overwhelmed cop, or a street performer who could pretend to take control of the chaos. But no one seemed to know what to do. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and she caught sight of an older man trying to push his bicycle through the gridlock, muttering to himself, her shoulders slumped. She could fix this. She had to. All right, she muttered, cracking her knuckles. Let's just fix the damn horse. Lu Mei took a deep breath and, in a smooth motion, closed her eyes. She concentrated hard, focusing on the timeline that wrapped around her like a delicate web. The rift was subtle but undeniable. She could feel the wave of distortion where it bled into reality, a thin tear in the fabric of the present. Time itself had been stretched just enough for someone, from another reality to slip through. She had to patch it. With a single thought, she reached out to the flow of time and rewound it, just enough to return the horse to wherever it had come from. She pictured the intersection before the time fracture, with the street safe and ordinary. There, done, the rift snapped back into place and the horse disappeared. Just like that. No tutu, no top hat. Nothing. The cars resumed their chaotic honking, people muttered angrily, and the crowd began to disperse, grumbling but largely unaffected. Lu Mei, however, stood rooted to the spot, blinking rapidly as though coming out of a trance. She felt the usual flush of relief. It was over, everything was back to normal. Except, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. The world hadn't been affected in any obvious way, but it had been too easy this time. Maybe she wasn't fixing things as well as she thought. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out, saw the notification from her work group chat, and groaned. Lu Mei. Are you coming in today? Your boss just called you out. And we need those reports by lunch. Her stomach dropped. She'd completely forgotten about work. Great. Just what she needed. She had to pull herself together. There were bigger things than horses in tutus to worry about. But as she started walking briskly toward the subway, she couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder, just in time to see a brief shimmer in the air at the spot where the horse had disappeared. A ripple. Time crack, she realized. Another one. Another tear in the timeline. And just like that, Lu Mei knew, her powers were getting out of control. She'd been playing with fire and fire? Well, it burned. Lu Mei didn't like thinking about the details. She'd had her powers long enough to know the consequences weren't pretty. At first, it had been like a fun game, rewinding time to avoid small mistakes, pausing moments to admire the view, skipping over uncomfortable conversations. But over time, she'd started to notice things. Minor things. But things that began to add up. The air conditioner at her office would randomly freeze up. The trash cans on her block would occasionally dump their contents by themselves. Her reflection in the mirror would blink a second after she did. Sometimes, people she didn't recognize would wave at her as if they knew her. Strangers would mention places she'd never been, or events she hadn't attended, and occasionally, only occasionally, she'd have flashes of a memory that felt like it wasn't her own. The worst part? Those flashes weren't random. They were her mistakes. Moments where time had fractured because she'd messed with it one too many times, and when she'd started noticing the big ripples, that's when things got complicated. It wasn't just a horse with a tutu. It was the weather, freezing rain in the middle of a desert. It was entire towns disappearing overnight, only to reappear days later, miles from where they should have been. News reports about people having memories of entire conversations that never happened. Even worse, real historical events being altered in ways she didn't understand. Somewhere, somehow, time itself was breaking. Lu Mei spent her lunch hour at a small cafe, sipping iced tea and trying to clear her mind. But she couldn't shake the thought that there was something more to this than just her accidents. Was she the only one causing these anomalies? What if there were others out there who could manipulate time, too? That thought alone kept her up most nights. And then there was the matter of the time cracks. Those invisible tears in reality. She could feel them now, like an itch beneath her skin, like a signal that things were about to go wrong, terribly wrong. Her phone buzzed again. She saw the message from a friend, a notification from someone who, she knew, wasn't just any casual acquaintance. Meet me tonight. It's time to talk. I know what you've been doing. Tan. Lu Mei stared at the message. Her heart skipped. Professor Tan. The time fixers. That was exactly what she needed right now. Lu Mei didn't waste time thinking. She'd been getting increasingly used to acting first, thinking later. This time, however, her instincts told her that she couldn't just brush off the message. Tan wasn't the type to send cryptic texts for no reason. The last time he'd messaged her was years ago, and it had been a warning: stop messing with time. At the time, she'd shrugged it off. But now? Now, she wasn't so sure. The cafe was quiet, too quiet for a place in the middle of the lunch rush. Lu Mei fidgeted with her straw, watching the bubbles rise in her iced tea as she stewed in her thoughts. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call. The name on the screen made her stomach churn. It was Tan. Hello, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Mei. Tan's voice crackled over the line, sharp and urgent. You need to come to the lab. Now. There's something you've done. Something big. Lu Mei's fingers tightened around the edge of her glass. What do you mean? What's happened? I can't explain over the phone. Just get here as fast as you can. And don't use your powers. If you've messed with time recently, it's going to make things worse. This is serious. Lu Mei hesitated. She'd been trying to avoid dealing with the fallout of her actions, but Tan didn't scare easily. If he was sounding this frantic, something had gone very wrong. And, knowing her luck, it was probably her fault. "I'll be there," she said, hanging up without another word. She left money on the table for the iced tea she hadn't finished and slipped out of the cafe, merging into the throng of commuters in the busy Beijing streets. The city was its usual chaotic self, a mix of honking taxis, street vendors calling out to passers-by, and the constant hum of life. But for Lu Mei, the noise felt muffled, distant. She was already far away, mentally preparing herself for whatever Tan was about to throw at her. By the time she reached the building, her anxiety had spiraled into something darker. The doors to the lab were locked, but Tan was waiting for her in the lobby, looking as disheveled as she'd ever seen him. His usual calm demeanor had cracked, and in its place was a look of urgency that made Lu Mei's chest tighten. "Tan?" she asked, voice trembling despite herself. "What's going on?" He gestured for her to follow him without a word, and she did, hurrying after him down a sterile, white hallway. Tan's lab was tucked away in a corner of an unassuming building, one of those places that didn't look like much from the outside but housed some of the most advanced research in time theory and physics. It felt eerily quiet when they entered. "Is this about the cracks?" Lu Mei asked, her voice quiet. Tan's face hardened, and he nodded. "Yes. The cracks have multiplied. They're spreading faster than we expected. And Mei, we've found something. Something I don't think you're ready to see." She could feel her pulse racing. She wasn't sure what was worse, the cracks she'd been creating, or whatever it was Tan had discovered. They reached the center of the lab, where several monitors were flickering, displaying various readings and time patterns. Tan moved toward a console, typing furiously as Lu Mei stood behind him, trying to keep her cool. "Here," Tan said, turning the monitor toward her. On the screen was a map, scattered with red dots, some of them blinking ominously. "This is a real-time projection of the time fractures. They're not just localized anymore, Mei. They're spreading globally." Lu Mei leaned in, studying the map. The dots scattered across the world were growing in number, blinking faster, as if they were alive. Some of them overlapped, some of them moved, merging with other dots in ways that didn't make any sense. The fractures were expanding, bleeding into one another, their intensity escalating by the minute. "Is it because of me?" she asked, her voice small. "All of this?" Tan didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Finally, he exhaled and looked her in the eye. "Yes," he said. "And no. The fractures started with you, but they're being exacerbated by your actions. Every time you manipulate time, it creates a ripple. It leaves a scar. But now, Mei, now there's something else at play. The cracks are stabilizing in ways we didn't think possible. They're starting to self-perpetuate. They're becoming independent of your influence." Lu Mei blinked. The idea that something was beyond her control sent a shiver down her spine. She had always assumed that everything, every glitch, every rift, was her fault. But this? This was a whole new level of complication. Tan pointed to a large chart on the wall, which displayed data streams she didn't understand. "We've been monitoring the fluctuations in time. And what we've discovered is that something, someone, is actively manipulating the fractures now. This isn't just a result of your actions. Someone, or something, is pulling on the threads of time, causing the rifts to become more unstable. It's like they're trying to accelerate the decay." Lu Mei's stomach dropped. She took a step back, her mind spinning. "But who would, why would, I don't know," Tan cut her off, his voice laced with frustration. "But we need to find out. And we need to fix it before it's too late." Lu Mei clenched her fists. For years, she'd been living with the consequences of her mistakes. Now, there was someone, or something, else out there, playing with time like it was a game. She wasn't sure if she was angry or terrified, but she knew one thing for certain: she had to stop it. All right, she said, steeling herself. What do I need to do? Tan handed her a small device, something that looked like a high-tech watch. This is a time stabilizer. It will help you locate the fractures. We've mapped them out, but you'll need to enter them and correct the timeline manually. If the fractures are left unchecked, they will merge, creating a time singularity, and that will be the end of it. End of all of it. A time singularity. The idea sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie, but Tan's grim expression told her it was as real as the world outside the lab. The stakes had never been higher. Where do I start? Lu Mei asked, taking the device and strapping it to her wrist. First, you'll need to go to the center of the first fracture. I'll send you the coordinates. Tan paused. And Mei, do not use your abilities unless absolutely necessary. You don't know how far-reaching the consequences could be. The fractures are unstable, but if you push them too hard, they could collapse everything. She nodded, swallowing hard. She couldn't afford to mess this up. The journey to the first fracture felt surreal, as if the world around her was holding its breath. She had spent so many years tiptoeing around the consequences of her powers, but now she was about to dive headfirst into the very chaos she'd caused. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, but she pushed it aside. It was too late for hesitation. As the device on her wrist beeped, she felt the familiar tug in her gut, the sensation of slipping through time. She closed her eyes and focused, trying to center herself. She was no longer the scared, unsure girl who'd first discovered her abilities. She wasn't just fixing time anymore. This was about saving it. Lu Mei appeared in the middle of what seemed like a deserted city square, the landscape eerily empty. The sky above was a pale gray, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. The device on her wrist was blinking urgently, signaling the presence of the fracture. She scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of the anomaly. And then, with a sudden gust of wind, everything shifted. A rip in the air appeared, jagged and bleeding light. The fracture had formed. She wasn't sure how much time she had left before the situation got worse, but she knew she had to act fast. Without thinking, Lu Mei stepped forward, the familiar pull of time enveloping her as she approached the rift. The light from the fracture flickered violently, distorting the world around her. For a split second, she felt a flood of memories rush through her mind, memories that weren't hers. And then, as the rift opened wide, Lu Mei stepped into it, ready to face whatever she had to in order to fix what she had broken. Lu Mei stepped into the fracture, and the world around her immediately shattered. Time itself twisted like a piece of broken glass. One moment, she was standing in the deserted square, the next, everything was a blur of light and dark, flashes of memories that weren't hers, distorted echoes of past moments that seemed to collide with her present. She swallowed hard, focusing on the one thing that mattered, fixing the fracture. The rift wasn't just a tear in space, it was a rift in reality itself, an open wound in the fabric of time. She could feel the pull of it, a sickening sensation, like the ground beneath her feet was slipping away. It was colder here, colder than it should be in the middle of a summer afternoon, and the air tasted metallic, thick with the tang of distortion. The device on her wrist was flashing rapidly, signaling the center of the fracture. She didn't hesitate. Lu Mei moved forward, carefully stepping through the chaos, trying to find her footing in a world that seemed to bend and stretch around her. She could hear voices in the distance, indistinct and echoing, as if coming from another time, another place. Shadows flickered in and out of existence, figures appearing and vanishing like ghosts, reminders of what might have been or what could still be. Then, at the heart of it all, she saw it. A massive, swirling vortex of light and shadow, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. The fracture was alive. The force of it almost knocked her off her feet, a wave of energy radiating from the center, pulling at her with an insistent, hungry force. Lu Mei felt the familiar sensation of being outside time, suspended in a place where past, present, and future tangled together like threads of a broken tapestry. She closed her eyes, grounding herself. She could fix this. She had to fix this. The device on her wrist beeped louder, pushing her forward. It was as though the fracture was aware of her presence, aware of her purpose. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was moving within it. Something beneath the rift, something more than just the rupture she had caused. She was beginning to realize that the fractures weren't just random accidents of her own making. They were something more, something deliberate. A voice cut through the air, clear and sharp. "You're late." Lu Mei's heart stopped, and for a moment, she couldn't tell if the voice had come from inside her head or from somewhere out there, beyond the edges of reality. She turned, but there was no one to be seen, just the strange, shifting landscape of the fracture. "You always were a bit slow," the voice continued, this time tinged with amusement. It was oddly familiar. "Did you really think you could keep this all under control? Did you really think you could play with time without consequences?" Lu Mei's pulse quickened. The voice wasn't just a disembodied echo, it was someone. Someone who knew exactly who she was. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you want?" There was a soft chuckle, and then, to Lu Mei's growing horror, a figure emerged from the shifting shadows. It was a man, tall, with a sharp, angular face and eyes that seemed too old for his young appearance. His clothes were tattered, as though he'd been caught in the same distortion as she had, and his movements were fluid, almost unnatural. He stepped forward with a confidence that was both unsettling and familiar. The man smiled, a thin, mocking smile. "I'm the one who's been helping you, Lu Mei," he said, his voice smooth like silk. "In a way, at least." Lu Mei's mind raced. "You, what? Who are you?" He raised an eyebrow, as if amused by her confusion. "Oh, don't play dumb. You felt it, haven't you? The subtle shifts, the whispers in the cracks. I've been planting little seeds here and there, nudging you along. You think this is all just a coincidence? That the fractures are your fault? No, Lu Mei. You've been doing exactly what I've wanted all along." Her heart sank. "You've been manipulating me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He laughed again, and this time the sound wasn't comforting. It was cold, distant, and utterly without warmth. "Manipulating? Oh, no. I'm just nudging. Encouraging. Letting you find your path." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've always been so eager to fix things, so eager to play God with time. It was inevitable that you'd break something. But you don't even understand the true consequences of your actions. You have no idea what you've unleashed." Lu Mei's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to lash out, to stop him from speaking, but she had to focus. The fracture, the real fracture, was here, and it needed to be fixed. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. "I want what you've given me," the man replied, his smile widening. "A world that bends. A world where I can make time dance to my will, just as you've been doing. You've opened the door, Lu Mei. Now, all I have to do is walk through it." She froze. The realization hit her like a freight train. "You're the one causing the fractures," she said slowly. "You're the one manipulating time. You're the reason everything's falling apart." He inclined his head, conceding the point. "Yes, but only because you opened the door. You've played with time like a toy. Now I'm playing for real." The anger that had been building inside Lu Mei flared. She had spent so long trying to fix the cracks, trying to undo the damage she'd done. And now this man was admitting that he had been orchestrating it all. He'd been pushing her, guiding her, making her make the mistakes that had led them here. The fractures weren't just the consequences of her actions, they were part of his plan. "No more games," she said, her voice low, steady. "You want to manipulate time? Not on my watch." The man's smile faltered, just for a moment. Then, he stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Ah. The little fixer finally understands. But you're too late. The fractures are already beyond your control. There's no fixing this now. You can't stop me. Lu Mei gritted her teeth, reaching for the device on her wrist. She had to act fast, had to stop him before it was too late. But just as her fingers brushed the device, the world around her began to shudder. The fracture pulsed again, growing in intensity, and the shadows began to close in around her, like a rising tide. She could feel the fabric of time stretching beyond its limits, threatening to tear apart completely. The fracture was swallowing everything. You've been a useful pawn, Lu Mei, the man said, his voice laced with finality. But the game's over. Without warning, the fracture surged, pulling Lu Mei toward it. Her feet left the ground, and she was yanked forward, a scream caught in her throat as the world around her dissolved into pure chaos. The sky, the ground, the city, they all vanished, leaving only the raw, unfiltered energy of the fracture. But even as everything seemed to be slipping away, Lu Mei didn't let go. She couldn't. She refused to let time be taken from her like this. With a final burst of effort, Lu Mei activated the time stabilizer, focusing every ounce of her will into the device. The fractures screamed as they fought back, but her resolve held firm. She wasn't going to let this man, whoever he was, win. She wasn't going to let him rewrite time to his will, and with that final push, the rift shattered, sending a wave of energy crashing through the air, a burst of light so bright it nearly blinded her. For a moment, everything was still, and then, slowly, the world began to rebuild itself. Lu Mei opened her eyes. The fracture was gone. The man was gone. The chaos had ended, for now, but Lu Mei knew, deep down, that the fight wasn't over. There would always be someone, something, waiting in the cracks of time, ready to bend reality for their own purposes. And she, the time fixer, would be there to stop them, because time was a delicate thing and she had to protect it.